You know that moment when someone asks you a question and you feel the old reflex kick in? Your mouth opens. Your brain starts assembling context, background, footnotes, a small legal defense team. You're about to explain yourself, again. And then, for once, you don't. You just stop. You give a short answer, or no answer, or a calm, "that's what I decided," and you watch something strange happen in the room. The energy shifts. Someone blinks. Someone leans back. Someone suddenly looks unsettled. If you've ever done this, you know it's oddly powerful, also a little terrifying, because explaining yourself has been a lifelong habit for most people. We explain why we're late, why we said no, why we feel tired, why we chose this job, this partner, this boundary, this version of ourselves. We explain so people won't misunderstand us, or judge us, or leave. So what actually happens psychologically when you stop doing that? What changes inside you, and what changes in how people treat you? And why does it feel freeing one moment and deeply uncomfortable the next? That's what we're unpacking, and by the end, you might recognize yourself more clearly than you expected. There's a first type of person who stops explaining themselves almost by accident. Picture someone who's been nice their whole life, the reliable one, the one who replies thoughtfully, smooths over tension, adds clarification so no one feels awkward. They're used to being liked, or at least not disliked. One day, they say no to something. Maybe it's a favor, maybe it's an invitation, maybe it's an expectation that's been quietly draining them for years. And out of habit, they start to explain. "It's just that I've been really busy lately and I'm not feeling great and..." But then they stop mid-sentence. They realize something. The explanation isn't for clarity, it's for permission. So they just say, "I can't." And the other person waits. That pause is everything. Psychologically, explaining yourself often functions as a social pacifier. It soothes other people's discomfort with your autonomy. When you stop explaining, you remove the cushion. You force others to sit with the reality that you made a choice without asking them to approve it. For people who've been conditioned to keep the peace, this moment can feel like standing in public without clothes. Your nervous system expects backlash, rejection, guilt. But often, something else happens instead. The other person accepts it, or doesn't know how to push back, or reveals that they were benefiting more from your explanations than you were. And inside you, something shifts. You realize how much energy you were spending managing other people's emotions, not maliciously, just automatically. Maybe this is you, or maybe it's someone you've watched quietly change over the years. Then there's another profile. This one looks more confident on the surface. This person stops explaining themselves not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. They've reached a point where they know their values, they know their reasons, they just don't feel the need to broadcast them anymore. Imagine someone who decides to leave a job that looks perfect on paper, good salary, prestige, family approval. When asked why, they used to give a whole TED Talk: burnout, misalignment, growth, mental health. They wanted to be understood. Now they just say, "It wasn't right for me." This kind of non-explanation can unsettle people even more because it removes the debate. There's nothing to argue with, no details to poke holes in, no entry point for advice. Psychologically, this reflects a shift from external validation to internal authority. The person no longer needs agreement to feel secure in their decision, and that changes the power dynamic in subtle ways. People may project on them. They think they're better than us. They're being secretive. They're hiding something. But what's really happening is simpler. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop offering your inner logic for public review. And not everyone is comfortable with that, especially those who rely on comparison to feel grounded. If you've ever noticed people pushing harder for explanations when you seem calm, that's often why. Your certainty highlights their own uncertainty, not intentionally, just by contrast. Another pattern shows up in relationships. This one is quieter and often painful. Picture someone who's been misunderstood repeatedly. They explain how they feel. It gets minimized, reframed, corrected. You're too sensitive. You didn't mean it that way. That's not what happened. After a while, they stop explaining. Not dramatically, not as a statement. They just withdraw their inner world. They answer politely. They listen, they nod, but they don't elaborate anymore. Psychologically, this is a form of self-protection. When explanations are consistently invalidated, the mind learns that sharing equals vulnerability without reward, so it conserves. What's interesting is how this gets misread. Others might say, "You've changed, you're distant, you don't open up like you used to." But from the inside, it doesn't feel like distance, it feels like containment, like finally closing a door that kept letting cold air in. This kind of stopping doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels resigned. But over time, it can become a filter. The person learns who asks to understand and who asks to control, who listens and who just waits for their turn to respond. If this resonates, it's worth asking a gentle question. Did you stop explaining yourself because you grew or because you gave up? The answer matters, and it can change. Then there's the type that most people misunderstand, the person who stops explaining themselves and suddenly gets labeled as mysterious, intimidating, or even arrogant. Think of someone who used to overshare. They filled silence, justified every choice, preempted every possible criticism with a disclaimer. And then, one day, they go quiet, not withdrawn, just selective. They speak when they have something to say. They don't rush to clarify. They don't correct every assumption. They let people sit with their interpretations. Psychologically, this taps into something ancient. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. When information is missing, the mind fills the gaps. Silence invites projection. When you stop explaining yourself, you become a mirror. People see in you what they expect, fear or desire, and that can feel powerful, or lonely, or both. The irony is that this kind of silence often emerges from self-knowledge, not superiority. The person knows that being fully understood by everyone is impossible anyway, so they stop trying. They choose resonance over reach, depth over clarity, and yes, that comes with trade-offs. Fewer people feel close to you, but the ones who do usually matter more. But here's the twist. Not all stopping is healthy. There's another version that looks similar from the outside, but feels very different inside. This is the person who stops explaining themselves as a form of quiet rebellion. They've been questioned, controlled, or micromanaged for so long that explanations feel like surrender, so they refuse. Not calmly, but rigidly. They give short answers not from peace, but from tension. Their silence isn't spacious, it's tight. Psychologically, this is still reactive. It's autonomy built against something, not from something. And while it can feel empowering at first, it often keeps the nervous system on edge, always braced, always ready for the next intrusion. If you've ever noticed yourself going silent with a clenched jaw, this might be familiar. The body tells the truth before the mind catches up. The difference between grounded non-explanation and defensive non-explanation is subtle but important. One feels like standing tall, the other feels like holding your breath. So what changes socially when you stop explaining yourself? First, some people step back. They lose access to your inner reasoning, and with it, a sense of influence. That can create distance, sometimes permanently. Others step closer. They ask better questions. They listen more carefully. They respect your boundaries because they sense they won't be negotiated through guilt. And some people push, harder than before. They demand clarity. They provoke. They test. Not because you owe them anything, but because your silence disrupts the role they had assigned you. This is often the most uncomfortable part. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't just change your behavior, you change the script, and not everyone knows their lines anymore. Internally, the effects are just as layered. You gain time, mental space, less second-guessing, fewer imaginary arguments in the shower.